There you go.
There we go.
Well, good morning from the Northern Alps of River Mountain Ranch. It's cold out here, but the view is beautiful. So I know you have similar views from where you are. Last week, Cheryl led the group in discussing the integrity question, and that was, am I being honest with myself, really? I think Cheryl did a great job, and I enjoyed reviewing that presentation again. This week, though, we're going to deal with the legacy question. And that is, what story do I want to tell? Every decision we make becomes a permanent part of our story, the story of our life. Every decision has an outcome, a consequence, and a result. It may be good or bad, desirable or undesirable, expected or unexpected. So when we're making a decision of any magnitude, we owe it to ourselves to pause, look ahead, and ask ourselves, what story do I want to tell? But let's set that question aside for just a moment. And I'd like your observations on and feedback on the request that Bill posed in the email he sent out on Thursday introducing this week's topic. I'd like anyone in the group and all of you, if you'd wish, to describe the positive legacy of someone you admire and tell us what makes their story worth celebrating. Yes,
I've
ma'am,
got
Sylvia.
I've got one. And it's my daddy. He grew up in East Texas, son of the sheriff of the county, very, very poor. Met my mother, and they married when she was 16 and he was 19. And at that point, he gave up a scholarship, a basketball scholarship to go to Sam Houston State just to be married. Uh, and he was married for 78 years. They moved to Corpus, and Daddy got into at the lowest level of the oil refining company and worked himself way, 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 way up over the years. But the story I really want to tell is when it was time for me to go to SMU, it was a very expensive place to go, and Daddy actually had to get a side job in order to have enough money to pay for my tuition. But that was how important it was for me to go to school and get my degree, which he had not. As the years went by, unbeknownst to me, Daddy was socking money away little by little over the years. And as it turns out, long term, it was so important that the grandchildren got their degrees that he ended up completely funding every grandchild, all five grandchildren, for not only their tuition, but every little extracurricular thing that they could possibly do, the educational trips, all the different postgraduate things that they could do. And this was all a legacy that we just, I mean, Daddy's been dead now for years, and yet every year when one of the grandchildren graduates, we always say, thank you, Pap. Thank you, Pap. It's because of him that that education prevails in this family, and it's a truly, truly strong and wonderful way to think back on the sacrifices that my parents made just in order for our kids, our grandkids, to have this great start in their life.
That's a wonderful story, Sylvia. Gary, you're muted.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Did you have something?
He was just clapping.
I was just applauding the story.
That was a beautiful story.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
This is about both of my parents, and but my father was he was 18 when he joined He went to World War II. He was in the Air Force for 30 years, and he was in the World War II, Korean War, and the Vietnam War. During that time, when he came back after World War II, there was a lot going on in our country, a lot of anger. And he was from a farming community in Illinois. And his father had been in World War I and was gassed, so he was helping farm. But there was a lot going on, so he re-enlisted into the Air Force, and he was in the Air Force for 30 years. At that time, my mom was in her third year of nursing school at a Mennonite hospital. And at that time, you couldn't be married and go to school. So they got married in secret. And then my mom got pregnant, but they both went on to, it's the same kind of thing about what Sylvia was saying. They sacrificed a lot. They felt like education was a big deal for my sister and my brother. And they made sure that they set up a long line of legacy for all of us to go to school. And even though my mom had to quit nursing school, and they just put a lot of heart and soul into that legacy for not only us children, but the grandchildren too. And taught us a lot of values, a lot of example about perseverance and kindness, and just like this story about Joseph doing the best you can, putting your best foot forward and doing the right thing.
Yeah. Another good story from the greatest generation, right?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Keep your hand up.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Mine has to do with people that I have known. And this is Created for Commitment. And it was Audrey Winthrop Johnson. And she's the one that started Bible Study Fellowship and what all she had to go through to get it going. And now Rosemary Jensen has taken over that. And they're just two ladies that I admire. And can I do another one?
Absolutely.
Okay, the other one was Joanna Weaver. And she did Having a Mary's Heart in a Martha's World. And this book changed my life concerning priorities. Get your priorities right and put Jesus first. And the third one is Phyllis Clark Nichols. And she is the lady that is just full of sunshine and brightness and full of the Lord and encourages everyone. And I love her.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am, Dora. You're muted.
I didn't want to unmute until you recognized me. I want to mention one that is a living legend, like just mentioned, and that's Alice Plummer. I can tell all kinds of stories about Alice, but I wanted to tell you one that really touched our hearts. Forgive me. Most of you know that we had a second son, and he passed away at 2.5. He had a birth defect of a valve in his heart. His heart was not chambered correctly. And everybody was scared to death to even, have any kind of responsibility for that baby. We had problems finding a doctor. It was surprising how hard it was to find somebody that would just a regular general doctor at that point. I didn't even try for a pediatrician. We were here, and that was back in the 80s, and that was a long way to San Antonio for a pediatrician when you could get a local doctor. But Alice and George one night babysat for us. We took both kids over to their house, and they babysat for us so we could go out. We had not been out in a year. you know, and just that kind of love and that kind of finding little things in life that she could help you with, remembering kids' names, remembering to check on people that are, she always asks about our kids. And I'm sure that most of y'all have stories about her too, including the biscuits. But I just wanted to recognize the fact that we do have living legends right now and all. And I just, every time she walks into church, the fact that she walked into church the Sunday after George passed, that kind of thing. A very strong, very, very sweet lady.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Dora. Anyone else? Yes, Gary.
Well, I want to talk about something that's been a tremendous influence on my life, and I'm sure Carol's life, and that's the Voyagers class. We are a great group of people. It's been everybody is so supportive, and it's all melded so well together that we have this meeting of the group every Sunday, but also other days during the week. We're always supporting each other and moving us to a better life in Christianity. It's been a great influence in my life, and each and every one of you, individually and collectively, I want to just praise you, thank you, and that's been I think lesson we started 20 years ago or more. Started the Voyagers class, and so the Voyagers class had people come and go. There's a core, there's a group. We all love each other and take care of each other in different ways. So that's something that's been important to me.
And I'd like to just add too, as sending out the prayer list, they're the ones that go. I asked, do you want to stay on our list? And yes, we have like 75 or almost 80, and it's pretty amazing. And another thing too, the prayers. Oh my gosh, I know probably Sylvia, the Griffins, Sylvia and Paul felt them too, but Gary and I did too. Yeah. We felt those prayers this week, and they were pretty amazing. So thank you.
Well, you both beat me to it. I think as we look around the screen and think about the people that are part of the class that couldn't join us today, we really, each one of you is a legend in my mind, and in Sherry's as well, for everything you do for each other and for one another and for the church community and the community writ large. I think it's just amazing. Is there anyone else that would like to offer anything? Yes, sir, Bill.
I'll make it quick because I know your time's running out here. But I just had to say that one of my heroes has quite a legacy while he's still alive, is none other than Les Huffman, who started this class. But he's one of those guys that follows in the steps of Jesus. When it says that he went about doing good, that Les is that kind of fella. I mean, we can list all the hundreds of little things that he does for all of us. And not only that, running this class, but for instance, when the treatments for my cancer got so bad it messed up my legs and neuropathy in my hands, I couldn't hardly stand up. Les surprised me by coming over and installing grab bars in the shower, in the restroom, everywhere. I didn't even ask him, and he's just that kind of guy, going about doing good. And all of you know what I'm talking about, from heart to heart to the soldiers to everything. And I just want to say, now that is the kind of legacy that Jesus told us in the story of the Good Samaritan, and everywhere he went. Les is just that kind of guy. Thank you, Les, for being a living legend.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank everyone for your insight and the really good examples. By the way, and as an aside, I had considered offering the one of you who gave the most good examples a Shetland pony, but I had it on pretty good authority that probably wasn't a very good decision. So we probably ought to go ahead and move on. So With this, at this juncture, why don't we listen to what Andy Stanley has to share with us this week? So, Ralph, if you go ahead and get the video started for us.
This request is going to, Les is going to have to allow me to share as well. Here we go. We're good.
I have no audio.
Ralph, I think you have to enable that audio when you share your screen.
Yeah, I'm going back to it. Give me a second.
Yeah. I'm glad you're not saying Mark.
Well,
So one thing I think we all have in common is our love of story, right? Our love of story. We all love a good story, whether it's a book or a movie, maybe part of a comedy series, fiction, nonfiction. I love historical fiction. Maybe it's something that happened to a friend. Maybe it's your most embarrassing moment. We all love to hear, and many of us enjoy telling stories. What's not apparent that should be is that each of us is actually creating a story, the story of our lives. It should be apparent because when someone asks you about your past, you know, where you're from, how you met, where you went to school, what do? You dip back into a chapter of your story, the story of your life. Now, if you were like me growing up, you were interested in your parents' stories, right? I loved to ask my parents when I was growing up, I loved to ask them about when they got in trouble as kids. For some reason, those were my favorite stories. Maybe it just made me feel better about myself. I don't know. But if your family is anything like mine, there may actually have been some legendary stories in your family, right? Stories that you enjoyed hearing over and over and over, and stories you ask your parents or maybe somebody else in your family to tell over and over and over. But here's the thing. While those events are happening in the past, nobody is thinking in terms of story, right? What are they thinking? They're thinking in terms of current events. I mean, it wasn't a story, it was something that was happening in the moment. And this sets us up for where we're headed today. Every significant or unusual current event in your life, even a season of life, once it's behind you, once it's behind us, what do we do with it? We reclassify it as a story we tell, or a story we hope we never have to tell, a story too embarrassing or painful to tell. And often the determining factor as to whether or not we want that story to be told is the decisions we made while the story was unfolding, right? The truth is, we write the story of our lives one decision at a time. Whether it's a thoughtful response or an emotionally fueled reaction, we write the story of our lives one decision at a time. More on that in just a minute. Today, we're in part 3 of our series, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And the big idea behind this series is simply this. It's the often overlooked relationship between good questions and good decisions. And as we've said, good questions set us up for good decisions. And in fact, in some way, our decisions are no better than the questions we ask or the questions we don't think to ask. And here's the promise of this series. If you will ask, and if you will answer honestly, and then if you will act on your honest answer to the 5 questions that this series is built around, I promise you will make better decisions, and consequently, you'll live with fewer regrets. Your life will actually be better, and the people who look to you, the people who depend on you, their lives will be better as well. Because, and you know this, we aren't the only people we aren't the only people impacted by our decisions. And we are not the only people impacted by our regrets either. Now, in part one, I suggested you memorize this saying, a saying from the book of Proverbs. And here's the saying. I hope some of you've memorized this. The prudent see danger, and they do something. They respond appropriately. They take refuge. But the simple or the naive, they just keep on going and they pay.
$50 one.
And the reason I want you to commit that saying to memory is this. As simple and as straightforward as these 5 questions are, they will bring you into conflict with the sales associate that lives in your head, just as they bring me into conflict with the sales associate that lives in my head. Because this little sales associate that lives in your head and his or her voice sounds a lot like your voice, right? They want you to act now. They want you to decide fast. They want you to focus on the immediate rather than the ultimate. And this verse is a reminder to look beyond the moment and not to look away from the potential danger associated with one of the options you catch yourself selling yourself on. These 5 questions will slow you down, and they will create the perspective you need to see danger coming. This verse will give you the perspective you need to connect the dots between the options you're considering and a future you may prefer or a future you would prefer to avoid. Now, last time we introduced the first of our 5 questions. The first question was the integrity question. And the integrity question is, am I being honest with myself? Am I being honest with myself? Really? So I hope since last time we met, you have been being honest with yourself, really. And I hope you've been being honest with yourself, even if the truth about yourself made you feel a little bad about yourself. Because as we said last time, acknowledging where we are is the first step to getting where we ultimately want to be. So when making a decision of any magnitude, ask yourself, am I being honest with myself? Really. Today is the second question, and I call this the legacy question. The legacy question. Anytime you're making a decision of any magnitude or of any consequence, I want you to pause and ask the legacy question, which is, what story do I want to tell? What story do I want to tell? Think about it this way. When this decision, or maybe this entire season of life, when this relationship, when this business transaction is reduced to simply a story that you tell, what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? Do you want to be the hero, or do you want to be the villain? Do you want to be the good example, or do you want to be the bad example? Which option will make this a story worth remembering, as opposed to a story you hope no one ever tells and no one ever finds out about? Which option would make this a story you'll be proud to tell your children someday, maybe even your grandchildren? And here's the good news. Here's the good news. You get to decide. But you decide one decision at a time, because as far as it is up to you, you write the story of your life one decision at a time. And every decision you make becomes a permanent part of the story of your life. Every decision you make has an outcome, a consequence, a result, maybe good or bad, desirable, undesirable, expected, unexpected, whatever the case. That outcome becomes a permanent part of the story of your life. Your boss comes along and he asks you to lie to a client, and you choose to lie to the client, and the client finds out and calls you on it, and the boss lays the blame on you, and you lose your job. Now, part of your story is that you lied and you lost your job because you lied. It's not a good story. What about this story? Your boss asks you to lie and you choose not to lie, and you lose your job because you wouldn't do what your boss asked you to do. It's not a great story, but that's a better story, right? Or how about this one? You met this guy. He was just kind of okay. He was convenient. There wasn't anybody else on the horizon. Something in you knew this really wasn't something you should pursue, but you did anyway. And 2 years later, the whole thing just evaporated. It's pretty much a story you hope no one even asks you about, a story that no one finds out about. How about this one? Your friends wanted you to go out, but you had an exam to study for, and you said no. You stayed in and you studied and you aced the exam. And that was a decision you made over and over and over, and now you have a degree to show for it. That's a good story. The point is simply this. Every decision and the outcome of that decision becomes part of your story, which means decision by decision, you are writing the story of your life. That's why when you're making a decision of any magnitude, you've got to pause, look ahead, and think, when this is nothing more than a story I tell, what story do I want to tell? The decision you are wrestling with right now is going to be nothing more than a story you tell someday? What story do you want to tell? Now, the challenge with all of this is this. In the midst of current events, in the midst of circumstances, we don't think of our lives in terms of story. Now, it is a story, but we don't think that way. For example, if you recently lost your job, surviving this season without a job, well, one day this is just going to be a story that you tell. What story do you want to tell? I lost my job. I was embarrassed. I started drinking too much. I racked up some unnecessary debt. I lost the respect of my friends and my kids. That's not a great story. It's understandable. I mean, losing a job, going for a prolonged period of time without work is terrifying. It's terrifying. But the decisions we make in the valleys eventually are just stories we tell on the other side. Or maybe back to the dating thing, you're dating someone and things are going okay, but there's someone else in the picture. And yeah, she's married or he's married, but you find yourself gravitating in their direction, and they seem to be gravitating in your direction as well. And you get the sense that if you're willing, they're willing. Your decision will be a permanent part of your story and hers and his. What story do you want to tell? I got involved with someone at work who was married. I ended up busting up a marriage. Now their kids ping pong between two homes on the weekends. Is that the story you want to tell? I don't think so. Now, here's something that I think is true of all of us. You'd like to be able to tell your entire story without skipping any parts, without skipping any chapters, or having to lie about the details, right? Someday you'd like to be able to sit down with your kids, or maybe even your grandkids, or maybe someone you hope to spend the rest of your life with and tell your entire story. And isn't it true? You'd like to be the hero in your story. I think we all want that. And I think going forward, you can have that. But it will require you to stop mid-decision and ask, what story do I want to tell? Which of the available options do I want as a permanent part of my story? Now, I think one of the reasons we don't think about story when we're making decisions is we get distracted by the pressure and the emotions of the moment, right? Emotion, when it comes to decision making, emotion is like a fog. It causes us to lose sight of the broader context, which is our story. And you know how this works. You're up against a deadline. You've got to decide. You've got to decide soon. If you won't marry me, I'm leaving. Nobody wants to be left. If you don't make your quota, you're fired. Nobody wants to be fired. When you're forced to make a decision under pressure, it is hard to think about tomorrow, much less your story, right? Because you've got to get through today. So whether it's love or fear or jealousy, the emotions associated with the decision-making process, they always complicate the process by focusing our attention on the immediate rather than the ultimate. And consequently, we're left thinking in terms of options, not our story. And the challenge is, and you know this, there are no emotionally neutral decision-making environments, right? When it comes to big decisions, it is almost impossible to be objective because of the way we feel, because of our emotions. This is why your worst decision, and I know we've never met, so I'm taking a gamble here, but my guess is your worst decision was fueled by something with strong emotional appeal, right? Maybe a first marriage that was pretty much doomed from the start. That purchase, that lease, it was so appealing you bought it. It was so appealing you ate it, you smoked it. It was so appealing you dated it, you moved in with it, right? And if you're in retail sales, you know exactly how this works. You know about the worst thing that you can let a potential customer do is leave the store or leave the showroom without making the sale. Why? Well, you know why. Because once they walk out, what happens? The emotional appeal of your product begins to subside, and they're far less likely to make the purchase. We've all experienced that. Now, psychologists actually have a name for this dynamic. It explains why once our appetites are engaged in the decision-making process, we to some degree, we kind of lose our minds. This cognitive bias has been labeled focalism, because the victims, and we've all been a victim of this, the victims hyper-focus on the one thing to the neglect of pretty much everything else. If you've ever been in love, and I hope you have, if you've ever been in love, you were a victim, or maybe you are currently a victim of focalism. It's wonderful. All you can see is him. All you can see is her. The point being this, in emotionally charged decision-making environments, whenever there is an emotionally charged decision-making environment, we think in terms of our options, not our stories. So here's a tip. When confronted with anything or anybody with strong emotional appeal, press pause, not play, because strong emotional appeal should trigger a red flag, not necessarily a green light. Instead of leaning in, we should step back. Not because, and this is important, not because he's not the one, he may be the one. Not because it's not a great investment opportunity, it may be a great investment opportunity. Not because it's not the perfect job, it may be the perfect job. But in spite of that, we should step back, because anything with strong emotional appeal, even the right thing, clouds our judgment. So just hit pause, get your bearings, go home and think about it, call a friend, and for sure, consider your story. Because when you consider your story, it places the decision-making process within the broader context of our entire lives. Now, the Old Testament story of Joseph, I think is a great reminder of how powerful and legacy preserving this question is. This is why I call it the legacy question. Now, many of you are so familiar with this story, you could tell it yourself, so I'll give you the condensed version. Around 1800 BC, a 17-year-old named Joseph, the 11th of 12 sons, finds himself in a no-win situation that is not of his own making. His father, Jacob, loved him more than all the other boys because Joseph's mother was his father's favorite wife, which fueled the fires of jealousy in his 10 older brothers. Eventually, as you probably know, their jealousy gets the best of them. They decide to kill Joseph. In the end, they lose their nerve and decide to sell him instead, which is a bit more merciful and way more profitable. And they sell him to slave traders. And then they tell their dad that he was killed by a wild animal. And now, and this is important, now these 10 young men, think about this, these 10 young men have a secret that they are forced to live with for the rest of their lives. They have a chapter in their lives they will be embarrassed to tell. I was so jealous of my younger brother that I, along with my other 9 brothers, beat him up and sold him. There were 10 of us and one of them, who wants to tell that story? And then we lied to my father and broke his heart and said that his favorite son had been killed by a wild animal. That's not a good story. And now, Joseph's brothers are liars for life. Please don't decide anything that makes you a liar for life. Here's why. Whatever you gain in the moment will not be worth what you're forced to carry into the moments that follow. Back to Joseph. So Joseph ends up on the auction block in Egypt, where he's purchased by a military officer named Potiphar. And now Joseph has a decision to make. Do I run? Do I do what most slaves do, as little as possible with as bad an attitude as I can get by with? Or do I throw myself into this whole slave thing with everything I've got? Interesting dilemma for a rich kid who grew up as his father's favorite son. And here's what makes this story so relatable for many of us. None of this is his fault. Somebody else took control of his story. His story, like parts of your story, were hijacked, commandeered by evil people, selfish people. So why try? Why care? That's always the temptation when someone else decides our story in a bad direction. But somehow, in some way, Joseph overcomes the negative inertia, the temptation to just throw up his hands and give up. He refuses to throw up his hands and let fate have its way. Instead, he decides to serve Potiphar's household as if it were his own. And eventually Potiphar notices, and he gives Joseph even more responsibility, and he ends up in charge of Potiphar's entire household. If you think about it, that's kind of a story worth telling, right? I was kidnapped once, I was sold twice, I was a victim, but I decided not to live like a victim. That was the story that Joseph decided, that was the story that Joseph was writing. But then the music changed, right? If you know this story, you know that his story intersected with somebody else's story, Potiphar's wife. And he finds himself once again, through no fault of his own, in a no-win situation, because Potiphar's wife insists that he become her lover, probably one of many lovers. And Joseph has 2 options, neither of which would lead to a good outcome. And it's important to understand, in this culture, this was not primarily a moral issue. This was a life or death issue. More like death or death, because either way he decided he could lose his life. And just to point it out, he's about 19 or maybe 20 years old when this part of his story unfolds. And once again, he opts for the better story. And it's at this juncture in his story, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to rehearse this story with you, even though it's so familiar. It's at this juncture in Joseph's story that he employs a powerful, powerful technique, something we should all employ. Here's what he does. Joseph actually rehearses his story out loud as the context for his response to Potiphar's wife. This is how we know he made his decision within the context of his life story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of paraphrase the first part of his response, and then I'll read the second part straight from the text. Essentially, here's what he said. Mrs. Potiphar, I came to this land as a slave. I had no rights and no future. Your husband purchased me, and I did my best to serve him and you. And through my hard work and my diligence and through God's help, I've gained the trust of your husband. He's put me in charge of the entire household. In other words, my story is getting better all the time. And then he says this, and I quote, with me in charge of the household, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owned, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. Implication, that's your story. Mrs. Potiphar, you really need to think this through. Do you really want affair with a Hebrew slave as part of your story? And then Joseph steps back into the broadest context of all. In light of all that's happened, in light of your husband's confidence in me, in light of God's mercy to me, he asked this question. How then, in light of all that, in light of the way my story is going, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Why would I want to add adultery to what's turning out to be a pretty good story with an ending I never dreamed possible? In other words, which of these stories, Mrs. Potiphar, do I want to tell? I only have two options. Story number one, your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way. I was faithful to him and to God who's been watching over and looking out for me. That's a good story. Or story number two, your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way, so I took advantage of his trust and had an affair with his wife. Which story do I want to tell? Which story do you want to tell? When the decision you are in the middle of making right now is nothing more than a story you tell, what story do you want to tell? Now, as you probably know, Joseph decided the better of those two stories. He did the right thing, but the right thing did not turn out for Joseph. Potiphar's wife accuses him of trying to rape her, and Joseph ends up in Pharaoh's dungeon. But Joseph's story wasn't over. And your story isn't over either. Now, it's true when we find ourselves in a long, difficult season and a long, difficult chapter of our story, it feels like this chapter is the entire story. But it doesn't have to be. Oftentimes, it's our responses, our decisions in those difficult chapters that make all the difference, between a story that ends bad and a story that ends well. Now, if you're familiar with Joseph's story, you know that while he was in prison, Joseph does the same thing he did in the dungeon as he did in Potiphar's household. He decides well, and over time, he wins the favor of the prison warden. Now, nobody's life ambition is to win the favor of a prison warden, but you know what? He just decided to do what he could do with what he had to work with, and before long, he's pretty much running the place. Several years later, and don't let that go by too quickly, several years later, he finds himself being ushered into Pharaoh's presence to interpret a dream, because Pharaoh had a dream that he believed had significance for the nation of Egypt. And none of his magicians could interpret the dream. And then, in another surprising twist in Joseph's story, Joseph assures Pharaoh that he can't interpret the dream either. And I think there was a gasp in the throne room when he said that. And then he looks at Pharaoh and says, but God is in the Hebrew God, which is a dangerous thing to say to someone who considers himself a god. God, who the Hebrew God, can interpret the dream for Pharaoh. Fortunately, that day, Pharaoh was more curious than furious, and he lets Joseph proceed with dream interpretation. So according to Joseph and according to the dream as he understood it, Egypt would experience 7 years of record-breaking grain harvest. Essentially, the Egyptians would be swimming in grain. And here's why that was a big deal. Bread was a staple for ancient people, all ancient people. So grain was the primary source for basically what constituted the dominant portion of the standard diet, which means if there's no grain, people literally starve. So this was great news. But that was just half of the dream. Egypt would experience 7 years of record-breaking grain harvest, followed by a famine so severe, Joseph said, that everybody's going to forget all about the 7 good years. Now, when Joseph finished interpreting the dream, everybody in the throne room assumed that Joseph was finished and he would be escorted out. But Joseph wasn't finished, and he does the unthinkable, and he gives Pharaoh unsolicited advice. Now, nobody gave the Pharaoh unsolicited advice, especially a foreigner who still smelled a bit like the dungeon. But this was the advice he gave Pharaoh. He said, "Oh, Pharaoh, somebody needs to wake up every single day focused on this problem. Somebody needs to wake up every single day focused on preparing Egypt for what's coming. So choose somebody you trust and put them in charge of grain storage." Silence in the throne room as everybody waited to find out what unimaginable horror awaited this arrogant Hebrew who would dare to give Pharaoh advice. But Pharaoh smiles, and he says to the people standing around, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God, Joseph's God, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you." And then to the shock and awe of everyone standing there, "You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And in this moment, Pharaoh makes Joseph the prime minister of Egypt. And once again, Joseph did what Joseph did. He decided well, and he devotes himself to this unprecedented opportunity. 7 years later, as he predicted, a famine devastates that region of the world. Once everybody's personal grain cupboards are bare, Joseph opens the federal grain silos and feeds the nation. And before long, people from all over that part of the world are caravanning to Egypt to buy grain, including, if you know this story, including Joseph's brothers. And when they arrived, he happened to be out that day, and he recognized them immediately. But of course, they did not recognize their 30-year-old brother, whom they had not seen since he was about 17 years old. Now, if you've never read this story in Genesis, you should. There are so many fascinating details we don't have time to explore today. But in the end, Joseph finally reveals his identity to his 10 older brothers, and they are speechless. Actually, they are terrified, and they beg for mercy they know they don't deserve, and in all likelihood will not receive. And they were so sure Joseph would do to them what they had done to him, because that's exactly what they would do to him if they were in Joseph's position. But, and here's the point of the story, Joseph wasn't anything like his brothers. And do you know why? Because throughout his life, Joseph refused to react. And in refusing to react, he avoided becoming like the people he didn't like. He decided against the gravitational pull of bitterness. So consequently, now that he's got the power, he is free. And he is free to write a better story. He decided his life in a different and a better direction. He decided a story worth telling. That's why we're telling his story. And in that moment, he made a big decision. He decided revenge would not be part of his story. So in addition to rescuing Egypt from the famine, Joseph rescues his entire family and their families as well, and he moves them all to Egypt. Now that is a story worth telling. A story he decided, one decision, one response at a time. Which brings me back to us, which brings me back to you? What story do you want to tell? What story do you want told about you? Like Joseph, like his brothers, you're writing the story of your life, one decision at a time. Don't do what his brothers did. Never, ever, ever choose the option that makes you a liar for life. Listen, this is so important. Long after whatever you gained is gone, you'll be left with your lie. You'll be left with a story you won't be proud to tell. Every relational, financial, professional, academic decision and the outcome of those decisions, they become a permanent part of your story. So write a good one. Decide a good one. And if you haven't decided a good one up to this point, remember this: your current chapter is just that. It's a chapter. It's not the whole story. So as we wrap up, I want to challenge you to make a decision right now. I want to challenge you to make this decision. I'll decide a story I'll be proud to tell. I'll decide a story I will be proud to tell. Every time you're faced with a decision of any magnitude, ask, when this is nothing more than a story I tell, what story do I want to tell? And then decide accordingly, because you write the story of your life one decision at a time. Write a good one.
Thank you so much for doing that, Ralph. He really gets on a roll. He speaks quickly, and he's kind of tough to catch up with. So I think, as Andy says, the choices that we make now will be nothing more than the story that we tell someday, or someone tells about us someday. So the question I would ask is, how does that reality focus you on your legacy? Would anyone like to offer their perspective? I'll offer that I think that the influencers of today often encourage us to live in the moment. We see that in all the advertising that we have. But I think that we need to put that phrase into context. And if we go back, I was going to say 30 years, but now it's closer to 50 years. Remember the old saying, if it feels good, do it. That was certainly a decision that was influenced by emotion, or the words that came from that 70s song. I think it was Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young that said, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with, right? Andy touched on something like that as well. We probably remember the beat of that song as we talk about it, but I digress. Patience is and remains a virtue. And I think if we can just think about the story we would like to tell versus the one we might have to tell or have told about us, it'll help us keep our focus going forward. Anyone else like to offer any words on that?
Jim, it's Dora.
Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking about this in the sense that most of us are sitting here in our late part of our lives, and we're looking at ahead and thinking, oh, I'm not so sure I like my story. Or what can I do to make my story continue, or something along those lines. And I think this was a really good lesson in thinking of it as one decision at a time. And that decision frequently has to be made day by day, over and over.
I agree. Thank you, Dora.
You might want to do when you're thinking about this, you think how you are, and ask the question of yourself, would I want to be related to this person?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir, Roger.
This is quite a coincidence. We're down here at the coast, and we have a book called Beach Calling, and it's a devotional journey for the middle years and beyond. and all of the questions are beach oriented. It was a book that was given to us in 2022 by Fred and Judy. And whenever we are at the beach, we just pick up that book and open it to any random place, any random subject, and start reading. We've been through the book many times, but the interesting thing, it is like Andy says, there are questions that we have to answer after reading. Sometimes we take the time to dig in and ask those questions and discuss them, and sometimes we don't. Today, the place we opened the book was to a chapter called Footprints. And Missy Buchanan, who is from Dallas, in fact, June Cheek knew them from attending church up there. And so today she writes about footprints, and she talks about taking off her shoes so she can feel the sand under her feet. And then the beach cleanses her soul, allowing her to slough off the worries, and it's where she attunes to God. But fast forward a little bit, and she says, when you watch your footprints disappear in the sand, how does that make you feel? Because she says she knows that she's creating footprints in the hearts and minds of others that will last even after her physical body becomes dust. And so when we got down to the end, but the way she sets up the questions was, she says, so much in life can be washed away in the blink of an eye, in careers and homes and health. Even so, those things that last imprint themselves indelibly on the lives of others. We have an opportunity to shape a legacy that will live beyond our span of years. How can we be intentional about creating a legacy of selflessness and faithfulness that will outlive our time on earth? And needless to say, we had a great long discussion, so we were not eager to get out to the beach this morning at all, have another cup of tea. And we were able to dig down and share what that passage meant to us, just like we're doing in this Sunday school class today.
Yeah, I think I love coincidence, right? I'd rather be lucky than good, Roger. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, ma'am, Phyllis, you're muted.
Of course, you know, I love stories. I write stories. And my goal as a writer has always been, since the Lord finally gave me the time to do something I'd wanted to do all my life, was to write stories that pointed to the truth with a capital T. But I want to tell you, every good writer of stories, or every writer of stories, needs a good editor. An editor that you trust with your story, an editor whose judgment you trust, an editor whose correction you trust. And I think when we're writing our life stories, the most important decision we make is, who is going to be my editor? And if our editor is not our Lord Jesus, then we're in big trouble. And that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I know with the length of the video that we had this morning, we're coming up on 10:30, and I know we all probably set aside about an hour. I'll touch on one more question, and then we can conclude. But without asking for any details, I was wondering if we agree that some of our worst decisions have been fueled by emotional appeal. I think he talks about that. We get into that and how it might have helped if we hit pause rather than play or fast forward when we got to that point. I've often described myself, and maybe in my own mind, as being conservative with myself, but liberal with others. But then other times I'm reminded by uh, the words of Toby Keith, which talks about the nights I'll never remember with the friends I'll never forget. And I wonder if that strikes a chord with anyone else. Anyone have any thoughts on that point? Okay. Well, as we close on our time, I want to thank you all. I want to thank Phyllis and Bill for recommending the series. I want to thank Cheryl for the great job that she did last week. I would leave you with one question that was posed, and that is, what one decision can we make this week that might change the trajectory of our lives going forward in our story? As we've hopefully discovered in this session, every decision that we make becomes part of our individual lives. As Andy said, every relational, financial, and professional decision and the outcomes of those decisions become permanent parts of our story. Everyone in this group, and certainly those we know, have lived long enough to have a few chapters where we wish we had an eraser, right? Some of us have a few stories which we wish we could rewrite. We all do. We call it regret. But chances are the decisions that led to our greatest regrets could have been avoided if we had paused to ask ourselves the legacy question. And that is, what story do I want to tell? From here on out, we should pursue a story that we'll be proud to share and others want to repeat, whether it be our friends, our spouses, our children, or our grandchildren. That happened in the life of Joseph, and it can happen in our lives too. His brothers, on the other hand, did not choose wisely, and they had to live with their lives. So if we're in the middle of making a decision right now, we should stop and ask ourselves, of the available options, which one do I want to be a permanent part of my story? That's the legacy decision. Thanks so much for your time and participation. And next week, we'll be back together to look at the conscience question. Thank you then. Yes, Ralph.
Let me just remind everybody, Jim, thank you so much for your time this morning, and we really appreciate you heading this up. Also, be reminded that Pastor Kim has posted, or my understanding, the sermon for today on the church website or on YouTube or on Facebook. You can probably find it. So if you want to listen to the sermon she was going to preach in person, it should be online by now. So just let y'all know.
Right.